pay attention, not because I'm asking you to, because what I'm about to tell you is the most important thing anyone has said to you in months, maybe longer. You went quiet. I know. I saw it. The moment you stopped pushing, stopped showing up in every room with something to prove, stopped responding to everything that used to pull a reaction out of you, you went quiet. And the world, your world, made a decision about what that meant. They decided you were finished. They looked at your silence and ran their calculation. They factored in the last time they saw you struggle, the last time something didn't go your way, the last time you looked tired, actually tired, in a way you couldn't hide. And they added it all up, and they landed on an answer. Done, burned out, couldn't hold it together. Peaked and retreated. They were wrong, not slightly wrong, not off by a margin, fundamentally, completely, catastrophically wrong. In the way that only people who never understood chemistry can be wrong about a reaction. See, there's something that happens in a lab, something that confuses every untrained observer every single time. A reaction reaches a certain point. The visible signs slow down. The noise stops. The movement becomes invisible to the naked eye. And every person watching from outside the glass concludes the same thing. It's over. It's not over. The most powerful transformations in any chemical process happen in the stage that looks like nothing is happening. The stage where the compound is rearranging itself at a molecular level, where the formula is being rewritten from the inside, where what's being built is invisible, until suddenly it isn't. You weren't finished, you were just changing the formula. Let's talk about what actually happened. Because you owe it to yourself to understand this clearly. You didn't go quiet because you gave up. You went quiet because something broke. Not you. Not your drive. Not your ability. Something broke between you and the version of yourself that was willing to keep performing for people who were never going to understand the performance. You got tired of explaining yourself to people who weren't listening, tired of proving yourself in rooms where the decision had already been made before you walked in, tired of pushing against systems that weren't designed to let you through, designed to look like they were, but never actually built with your success as a possible outcome. And at some point, somewhere between the last thing that didn't work and the next thing you didn't have the energy to start, you made a decision. Maybe you didn't even know you were making it. Maybe it just happened the way some chemical reactions happen, not as a choice but as an inevitability when the conditions finally shift. You stopped. Not because you had nothing left, but because what you had left was too valuable to keep spending on the wrong reaction. That distinction matters. Write it down somewhere. Burn it into the inside of your chest if you have to, because every person who watches you from the outside will never understand it. They'll see the stopping. They won't see what the stopping was actually protecting. You went quiet because you were carrying something they couldn't see. A formula that wasn't finished yet. A compound that needed time and pressure and the right conditions, not their spotlight, not their validation, not their rooms with their rules and their ceilings, just time, just silence, just the lab. But they don't know what a lab looks like from the outside. To them, silence looks like surrender. Stillness looks like stagnation. Withdrawal looks like collapse. Because the only metric they know how to read is noise. Movement, visibility, people who go quiet must have run out of things to say, so they buried you while you were still breathing. And that's when it started, the thing they'll never fully understand. Not because they're stupid, because they were never in the room when it happened. I want you to know exactly what happened while you were in the lab. Because you weren't watching. You were working. And while you were working, they were busy. They were doing what people do when they think someone is finished. They moved on. Loudly, they started talking about you in past tense, and not in a grieving way, in a relieved way. The kind of past tense that sounds like, remember when? Said with just enough smile to let you know the memory isn't painful for them. They updated the story they told about you. Quietly, without announcement, they revised the narrative, downgraded your chapters, smoothed over the parts where you almost made them irrelevant. Some of them filled your absence with someone who looked safer, someone who asked more questions and made fewer statements, someone who wouldn't make them recalculate, someone comfortable. Some of them started positioning themselves in the space you left, not because they earned it, because you weren't in it anymore, because empty space gets filled, and they were there and you weren't, and that's the only qualification they needed. Some of them said your name with a particular tone. You know the tone, the one that implies more than it says, the one that ends with a slight intake of breath and a small, sad nod, as if being uncertain about you is the most natural conclusion a reasonable person could reach. They packaged your silence into a story that made them look perceptive, like they'd always had a feeling about you, like your going quiet was the confirmation they'd been waiting for. And the cruelest thing? They weren't even angry about it. They weren't disappointed. They were almost relieved, because as long as you were pushing, as long as you were in the room, as long as you were running at full capacity in their direction, they had to work, had to keep up, had to actually compete with whatever you were building. Your silence gave them rest, and they took it, stretched out in the space of your absence like it was always theirs. That's what you need to understand, not to be angry, not to go back and confront anything they did while you weren't watching. You need to understand it because it tells you exactly what you are to them, not a colleague, not a peer, not a fellow traveler on the same road. A variable, something that changes the equation when it's present, something that makes the math harder when it's in the room, something that when it goes quiet makes everything measurably easier for everyone operating at a level beneath it. You were never their equal in their own calculations. You were the variable that made their calculations difficult. And now they think the variable has been removed. They're wrong. The variable went into the lab, and it's been working on something they don't have a model for yet. Here's what was actually happening while they thought you were done. You were running the experiment. Not the one they saw, not the one that was visible from outside the glass, the one underneath, the one that started the moment the noise stopped and the pressure dropped, and for the first time and longer than you can remember, you could hear yourself think. See, there's a thing that happens when all the external noise goes away, when you stop performing for audiences and start working for results. When you stop spending energy on being seen and redirect every single unit of that energy into the actual problem. The thinking sharpens, the vision clarifies. The calculations that were blurry under the pressure of other people's expectations become suddenly, almost painfully precise. You saw things in that silence you hadn't been able to see before. You saw exactly where the old formula was wrong, not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. Built on assumptions that were handed to you by people who didn't know what they were talking about. Assumptions about how things work, about who gets access to what, about what you're allowed to want and how you're allowed to pursue it and what counts as success and whose definition of that word matters. All of it. Wrong, and in the silence, with nothing to perform for and no one to explain yourself to, you started dismantling it, compound by compound, assumption by assumption. You stripped the formula back to its base elements and you looked at each one, really looked, and you kept what was true and you discarded what was inherited. What was told to you, what was installed without your consent by people who needed you to operate within a certain range. That process is not fast. No, the people watching from outside will never understand how long it takes to rebuild a formula from its base elements. They think transformation is an event, a moment, something that happens on a specific Tuesday and then it's done. They don't understand that transformation is a process, that the most significant changes in any system happen invisibly over time under conditions that look, from outside the glass, like nothing at all. They think your silence was emptiness. It was the opposite. It was concentration, the kind that requires total exclusion of distraction, the kind a surgeon achieves before an incision, the kind a chess player achieves 3 moves before checkmate, when they go very still and the stillness looks to everyone in the room like uncertainty. But to the player it's the most absolute clarity they felt all game. You were that still, not because you ran out of moves, because you finally saw the board clearly enough to pick the right one. And while you were seeing it, while you were running the calculations in the silence they mistook for defeat, something else was happening, something they really didn't account for. You were removing them from the formula entirely. Not out of anger, not as revenge, out of accuracy. Because when you stripped the formula to its base elements and looked at what was actually necessary, what was actually contributing to the yield you wanted, their opinion wasn't in there. Their approval wasn't a required ingredient. Their rooms, their rules, their timelines, their definitions of what counts and what doesn't count and who gets to proceed and who gets sent back to the beginning, none of it was in the formula. None of it was ever in the formula. You just couldn't see that when they were in the room, making noise, making themselves seem essential to the process. The silence showed you the truth. You don't need them for what you're building. You never did. Let me explain something about chemistry, because it matters here. There's a concept called a rate-limiting step. In any multi-step reaction, there's always one step that's slower than the others. One step that controls how fast the whole process can proceed, no matter how fast every other step runs. And here's the thing about rate-limiting steps that most people never learn. They look like failure. They look like stagnation, like the reaction stopped, like nothing is working. Because while that one slow step is completing, nothing visible is changing, the output isn't coming, the progress isn't showing. Every observer looking at the reaction from outside concludes the same thing. This isn't working. But the reaction is working. It's working at the only speed the rate-limiting step allows. And once that step completes, once that single bottleneck clears, the rest of the reaction runs in a fraction of the time, faster than they expected, more completely than they modeled, with a yield that makes everyone who wrote off the reaction look like they didn't understand the chemistry. Because they didn't. Your silence was a rate-limiting step, not a failure, not a breakdown. The step that had to complete before everything else could run. The clearing of contaminated assumptions, the rebuilding of the foundational elements, the painstaking, invisible, exhausting work of changing what you're working with at the most basic level, and it's slow. It was always going to be slow, not because you're slow, because that kind of work is inherently slow. You cannot rush the reconstruction of a formula. You cannot speed up the rate-limiting step by wanting it to be faster. Chemistry doesn't respond to impatience. It responds to conditions. And you created the right conditions. Silence, focus, removal of contaminating variables, absolute clarity about what the formula actually requires versus what you were told it requires. That's not failure. That's the most sophisticated thing a chemist can do. See, anyone can run a reaction they were handed. Follow the steps. Get the expected result. Operate within the established parameters. That requires competence, not mastery. Mastery is when you look at the established parameters and ask why they were set there, who set them, what they were trying to achieve, whether those parameters actually produce the best yield or just the safest yield for someone else's purposes. That's what your silence was. A complete audit of every parameter someone else set for your reaction. And you found contamination. You found steps that didn't belong in your formula. You found rate-limiting steps that weren't necessary, they were just there because no one had ever questioned whether they needed to be. And you removed them, one by one, in the silence. While they celebrated your absence, the formula you're running now isn't the one they gave you. It isn't the one they'd recognize. It isn't even close to the one they assumed you'd rebuild if you ever got back up. What's running in your lab right now is something they don't have a name for yet. And now, something is different. You feel it. You've been feeling it, that quiet shift in how you carry yourself when you're alone. The way the mirror looks different. Not because anything changed on the surface, but because something changed behind the surface. In the way you calculate, and what you're willing to accept, and the amount of space you take up in your own mind. You're not the same person who went quiet. That person was running an old formula. A formula with contamination in it, with other people's parameters, with rate-limiting steps that didn't need to be there. That person was brilliant, let me be clear about that, but brilliant and constrained is a very specific kind of suffering. Because you can see exactly what you're capable of and exactly what's preventing it. And that gap, that visible gap between potential and output, becomes unbearable at a certain point. That's when you went quiet, not because the brilliance ran out, because the constraint became unacceptable. And now you've spent the silence doing what needed to be done. And the person on the other side of that process, the person running the new formula, the rebuilt formula, the one stripped of contamination and false parameters and dependencies that were never real to begin with, that person is not who they buried. They moved on from someone they thought they understood. They closed the chapter on someone they thought they had figured out. They told the story of you with the confidence of people who've read the whole book. They haven't read chapter 1 of the version that's coming. And here's the thing about emerging from a silent transformation. It doesn't look like what they expect. They expect the person who went quiet to come back louder, to compensate, to announce the return with the kind of energy that's really just performance, really just a response to their skepticism. No, that's not what comes out of the lab. What comes out of the lab is quiet, controlled, precise, the kind of presence that doesn't need to announce itself because it changes the temperature of the room just by entering. The kind of certainty that doesn't argue, doesn't explain, doesn't justify, because it's not built on opinion, it's built on results. You're not coming back to prove something to them. You don't need to prove anything to them. Proof is for people who are still operating within their system, still trying to earn a grade in their class, still waiting for their permission slip. You're not in their class anymore. You spent the silence building something entirely outside their system, operating on parameters they didn't set, running a formula they don't recognize, And what's coming out of that lab isn't for their approval. It's not calibrated to their metrics. It doesn't need their sign-off. It just needs to work. And it works. That's what they're not ready for. Not the return of someone trying to win their argument, the arrival of someone who's already moved on from the argument entirely. Someone whose next move doesn't require a single one of them to cooperate with it. You changed the formula, and the new formula doesn't have them in it. They're noticing. Not all of them yet, but the ones who are closest to what you're doing, the ones who can smell a reaction even when it's not fully visible yet, they're starting to pick up something in the air. Something shifted, something that was quiet for long enough that they got comfortable with the quiet. And now the quiet has a different texture, a density to it, the weight of something that's almost done. They can't name it yet, but they feel it. And the feeling is not comfortable. See, your silence, the version of it they got used to, was the silence of someone they had categorized, filed away, processed and moved past. That silence was easy to live with because it confirmed their narrative, confirmed that their assessment of you was accurate, that their decision to move on, to fill the space, to write the past tense chapters, all of it was justified. But this silence is different. This silence has intention in it. Purpose, direction, the specific stillness of something coiled rather than empty. And they don't have a category for that. Their model of you doesn't include this version. Their calculations assumed a set of constraints that no longer exist. They're recalculating. Some of them are doing it consciously, running back through their assumptions, checking their work, wondering if they missed something in the original data that should have told them this was always going to be the outcome. Some of them are doing it in the middle of the night, in the way things surface at 3 a.m. when the noise dies down and the mind runs its honest accounting. They missed something. They all missed the same thing. They looked at your silence and saw absence. They should have seen preparation. They looked at your stillness and saw retreat. They should have seen recalibration. They looked at you going quiet, and they decided, with the confidence of people who've never spent a day in a real lab, that the reaction was over. They've never understood chemistry. A reaction that looks finished and isn't is not a dead reaction. It's a dangerous one. Because the energy doesn't disappear. It doesn't dissipate. It concentrates. It finds the pressure points in the container and it builds, and builds, and builds, until the container either changes the reaction or the reaction changes the container. You changed the container. You built a new one. Stronger, properly designed for what's actually happening inside it, rather than what someone else expected to happen. And the reaction running in that container right now is nothing like what they watched slow down and go quiet. The ones who are paying attention are starting to understand this. And the fear in that understanding isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's a quiet recalibration, a subtle repositioning, a certain care in how they say your name now that wasn't there before. Not respect yet, not full acknowledgement, but something. A first tremor before the recognition hits. Let them feel it. You don't need to do anything about it. No announcement. No confrontation, no return performance designed to underline what they missed. Just keep running the experiment. The results will say everything. Here's what they need to understand. What they'll understand eventually, whether you ever say it to them directly or not. You didn't break. You didn't burn out. You didn't retreat in defeat. You didn't go quiet because the noise won. You went quiet because you were done wasting reagents on the wrong reaction. Done spending premium ingredients on a formula that was never going to produce what you needed. You didn't lose your way. You found the lab. And in the lab, in the silence they called finished, you rebuilt everything. From the base elements. With no contamination. No false parameters. No rate-limiting steps that don't belong in your formula. You stripped it all the way down, and you rebuilt it the way it should have been built the first time, if the first time had been designed around what you're actually capable of instead of what they were comfortable with you attempting. The experiment isn't over. It's just starting to produce results. And the yield. What's coming out of that lab? What you've been building in the silence while they moved on and filled the space and wrote the past tense chapters, the yield is something their instruments aren't calibrated to measure. They thought the reaction was finished. They forgot. The most powerful compounds are the ones that form in silence.